Good evening. Welcome to this panel discussion with Dr. Dmitri Trenin on Russia, NATO and the Baltic towards neighbourliness, hosted by the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. Thanks to Professor Brendan Sims and his colleagues at the Centre for making this event possible. This is the 8th in this Baltic geopolitical programme series. There's been a lot of interest, and I'm delighted to say that with our colleagues in the network of universities in the region, we are now building a substantial programme of events and activities and a regular newsletter. If you're watching this and you haven't yet done so, please sign up to receive regular material. 148 people have registered for this event and maintaining a strong participation and activities and interest in them. This is an online video panel. We will end at 1900, 7 p.m. UK time promptly. I will moderate a discussion with Dr. Trenin for the first half hour, and then in the second half, I will relay questions from the audience to our panelists. You, as the audience, will be able to see and hear me and Dmitri. You will have your microphone and camera switched off automatically, so at no time will you be heard or seen by anyone in this webinar. However, you're still able to communicate with Dmitri and myself. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A option. Click on it, and when it opens, you have the chance to type questions. If you do type questions, please start by writing your name and your affiliation first. I will try and cover as many of your questions as possible, though in view of these numbers and time constraints, we might not be able to address everyone's points. Finally, I also want to let you know that this video panel is being recorded, and we will post the recording on our website over the next few days, and you should be aware of that. Now, our guest this evening is Dr. Dmitri Trenin. He is the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center. He's been with that center since its inception. He also chairs the Research Council and the Foreign and Security Policy Program. He served in the Soviet and Russian armed forces from 1972 to 1993, including experience working as a liaison officer in the External Relations branch of the group of Soviet forces stationed in Potsdam, and as a staff member of the delegation to the US-Soviet nuclear arms talks in Geneva from 1985 to 1991. He also taught at the War Studies Department of the Military Institute from 1986 to 1993. And then from 1993 to 97, he held a post as a senior research fellow at the Institute of Europe in Moscow. And in 1993, he was a senior research fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome. He's joining us now from his dacha, about 40 kilometers northeast of Moscow. And we very much welcome you, Dmitri, to this event. In the late 1990s, about 25 years ago, you wrote a piece, The Baltic Chance, the Baltic States, Russia and the West in the New Europe, in which you set out your hopes and expectations for the way in which this relationship could develop in the future. But then you published on December 31st last year on your centre's website, a piece, Respect Thy Neighbour, Russia and the Baltic Region. It's a very interesting piece, and it was that piece which stimulated us to invite you this evening. I'm going firstly to ask you, Dmitri, to introduce and summarize this piece for about 5 minutes. And I've asked you in that opening statement to highlight what you think are key action points for Russia and the West. We will then have a conversation. I'll ask a number of questions about the piece and also raise questions of the problem of trust and how we get to a relation of trust between Russia and its neighbours in the Baltic and indeed more widely. We agreed in our preparatory call to have a friendly and frank conversation, and that's what I hope and believe it will be. So Dmitri, could you kick us off by introducing and summarising the piece that you wrote for your website in December last year on Respect Thy Neighbour? Dmitri Trenin.
Well, Charles, thank you so much for this very generous introduction. Also for the invitation from your center to be with the audience tonight. It's a big privilege and an honor for me. Thank you also for paying attention to that short piece that we published just on New Year's Eve last year. And you asked me to summarize it in 5 minutes. Well, let me try to do that. I will start by looking at this a little bit unwieldy word, neighbourliness, that I used and you used in your introductory remarks. I think that one of the problems in Russian-Western relations, and in particular Russian-European relations or Russian-EU relations, was the failure to identify a realistic goal and a platform for those relations. I think that the idea prevalent in the days when I was finishing my military service and embarking on an academic career was that Russia would be progressively more like the West, more like the European Union. And although most people, or let's say most serious people, never considered Russia fit for membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or in the European Union, I think most agreed that Russia's path forward was through accepting and internalizing the norms and principles that Western institutions embodied. That essentially the future of Europe, let's say, or the future of Russian-EU relations or Russia-NATO relations should lie in Russia progressively Europeanizing itself. This, I think, I didn't think so at the time, but I think so now. And actually, I accepted this view a while ago. That was never a realistic goal, and that was never a realistic path for Russia and Europe to follow. And clearly, the penalty that both sides had to pay for that was mutual alienation. And by now, I think this alienation has almost reached the level of confrontation. It certainly has with the United States and with some countries in Europe, but with other countries, it's some of those other countries, it's coming to that level. I came up with a notion of neighborliness, and that I think is central to the piece that you have referred to as a realistic goal for the future. Mind you, I never put the word good in front of neighborliness. It may be good, it may be just tolerable neighborliness, but neighborliness is something that truly unites or brings together Russia and the rest of Europe is, I think, as good a platform as any for putting the relationship on a firmer and safer ground. I think that one of the, unlike in the Cold War, perhaps the most serious threat to European security, which means both NATO security and Russian security these days. There's no overarching architecture of European security, nor do I believe there will be in the foreseeable future. European security as it exists today is squarely based on deterrence, and basically on deterrence only. There are a few confidence-building measures, but otherwise it's all about deterrence. Since we talk about the deterrence as the basis of the security of Europe these days and in the foreseeable future, I think our task on both sides should be to minimize the chance of inadvertent conflict. In the days of the Cold War, conflict was not something that would happen by chance. Conflict was seen, and I, as someone, as you mentioned, someone who served in East Germany and had a chance to travel to the West in the line of duty quite often, several times a week, often, as often as that. In those days, we thought more in terms of a war as a result of irreconcilable differences between the two systems, each of which wanted to impose itself on the other. Today, I think we have a different situation, and war can happen as a result of incidents gone awry, whether over the Baltic Sea or the Black Sea, conflicts escalating. I'm thinking Ukraine, for example, or some mishap in faraway places such as Syria, with implications for Russian and NATO/US forces in Europe. So minimizing conflict, the potential for conflict, is one axis. Another axis is exploring and exploiting the opportunities that lie in the non-political realm. I do not expect any rapprochement between Russia and the West in the political terms, again, in the foreseeable future. But apart from politics, there are many other realms where I think contacts and productive collaboration can be possible. Climate, science, technology. Of course, there are sanctions all around, but there are ways that are still open for also people-to-people exchange and all that. And I think we need to look into the future. And the future, and this is the final, this is the conclusion to my opening remarks. This future, I think, should be based on mutual respect. Respect thy neighbor is the title of my short essay, and basically, I think we will have to reconcile ourselves to Russia and Europe being different. They are being different in terms of their political culture. They are different in terms of the values that their leaderships or their societies uphold. One shouldn't think on the Western side or on the Russian side that somehow the values are wrong, the system is wrong, and we would do our utmost to help the people shake off the yoke of the current system. I'm not just talking about the West thinking in terms of helping Russia or the Russian people democratize themselves. Not that the Russian people don't need democratizing the system or making the system cleaner, but that's the job of the Russian people themselves, as it is the job of the Europeans to manage their own systems, whatever Russians or others may think about the systems that or the ways and means that the Europeans are employing in the political or cultural or some other realm. So that's essentially the basis. Respect for diversity. Diversity has become a word in vogue on both sides of the Atlantic. So diversity will continue in Europe as long as the European Union on the one hand and Russia on the other hand share the same continent. So let me stop here. I may have abused my time limit, and I feel sorry about that.
You haven't abused it, Dmitri. It's been very interesting. You've identified three specific themes of your piece, which indeed emerge very strongly from the piece itself. You said in the piece that that Russia and its neighbours should start repairing their badly broken relationship on a common basis of neighbourliness. This would fall far short of partnership, but it would end unchecked hostility, and that's indeed what you've confirmed again today. But as I read the piece, and really as you spoke just now, I can't feel optimistic about the state of affairs. So if you look at that reducing inadvertent collision, you've got a series of proposals to do that, which are what I'd call good common sense about what ought to be done. But at the same time, you have events. The most recent in our minds is perhaps the decision by the Belarus government to bring down a passenger plane and take a Belarus individual off it, which was then completely, or seemed, but correct me if I've misunderstood this, to be completely endorsed by President Putin in a meeting with Lukashenko, I think on the Black Sea, supporting that action. And I don't really see how it's possible to operate in a way that reduces the inadvertent collision if that kind of act by the Belarus government goes ahead without sanction or without criticism from the non-Russian countries. I was surprised, frankly, that Russia did decide to so strongly back the Belarus government. But how do you see that? I don't feel at all optimistic about the possibilities of reducing the inadvertent collision. Do you think there's a ground to be more optimistic, more positive than I feel?
When I talk collision, Charles, I mean war. A real war for which I was prepared in the 70s and the 80s as I was serving in Germany. What happened in Belarus comes nowhere near that. So this is not the collision I'm referring to. You're talking about political collisions. I'm talking about military collisions. I'm talking about war. And that I'm putting the bar very, very low, where I think it belongs today. I said, and I would restate that, I believe that the confrontation in which Russia and the United States find themselves at this point will continue long after I'm gone. I'm talking decades, maybe a couple of generations. I don't know how long it will last, but it will certainly last a long time. The task at hand, I think, is to make sure that this confrontation doesn't lead to the kind of war that was always in our minds when I was wearing military uniform between 72 and 93. Well, maybe not until 93, but certainly until 91. So this is what I'm talking about. I'm not optimistic at all, but I'm trying to be a realist. And as a realist, I think that there's a certain number of confidence-building measures that would help both NATO and Russia to avoid something that neither side seeks at this point. Neither side seeks to attack the other. But there are incidents, there are periods of tension, like 6-7 weeks ago on the Russian-Ukrainian border, when Russia was trying to send a signal, as I understand it. But a lot of people in the West and in Ukraine were thinking that Russia was about to attack Ukraine, preparing to invade Ukraine. We must be very, very well informed about what the other side is up to. Not informed in terms of better intelligence collection, although this is always an important task of any government, but in terms of actually having a clear and adequate picture, a clear, adequate understanding of what the other side is up to. And if we have that, then I think it will be easier for us to steer clear of a collision.
I mean, I agree with that very much as an aspiration, Dmitri, but you're right that the reality is a long way away. If you look, for example, at the Salisbury Novichok attack and Skripals in the UK, or Sweden and Gotland during military exercises worried about Russians moving onto the island of Gotland, or the GRU bombing issues in Czechia, or a whole range of issues, and the very real fears in the Baltic States about a Ukraine-type situation on their borders of some actions. What I don't see is how you feel one could get to a confidence building process on this. You list a series of very good practical proposals: reliable 24/7 communications, regular personal contacts between the chiefs, incident prevention mechanisms, confidence building measures, exercising restraint. I agree with all of those things. They're the right thing, but I don't see how we are going to get to the process, certainly on the NATO side, but also on the Russian side, of having a sufficient level of confidence even to take those basic steps that you're describing.
Well, I think we have a certain level of confidence throughout this confrontation period. There have been very serious and I think very frank contacts between the top military officials in the United States and NATO on the one hand, and in Russia on the other hand. Security chiefs in Russia and the United States have regular contacts as well. So that's where we are. The embassies may be reduced to skeleton size, but the people who are in charge of each country's military and security apparatuses are constantly in touch. With regard to the things that you have mentioned, I would not want to respond with a list of Russian concerns, which are there as well. You see NATO forces essentially deployed within a 2-hour drive from St. Petersburg. That's a fact. You cannot undo that. You have Kaliningrad as an enclave within NATO territory. If you like, this is a kind of West Berlin in reverse. You have, from the Russian official standpoint, the West stole Ukraine by staging a coup d'etat in Ukraine and toppling the legitimate government of Yanukovych, helping the Ukrainian opposition all the way to get Yanukovych, to chase Yanukovych out of Kiev, out of power, while at the same time pressuring Yanukovych not to use force. I can talk about NATO enlargement, which to many Russians in power today is the ultimate evidence piece of Western perfidy. Mr. Putin, talking just yesterday in a wide-ranging interview on Ukraine, used very strong language. And I think it's an interview worth studying closely, because I think it contains some pretty dire warnings. In that interview, Putin basically said that he could not trust U.S. Denial that Ukraine is being offered a membership action plan to join NATO. So he believes, in other words, that Ukraine in NATO is a very realistic proposition seen from the US side and Western side. If that happens, Mr. Putin continues, this paves the way to American INF missiles based in the vicinity of Moscow, reducing the flight time to Russian vital targets to just a couple of minutes. I don't want to continue, but believe me, Novichok pales in comparison to the accusations that are being mounted against the West in the Russian official and semi-official discourse. So there's zero trust on both sides. I built my proposals, if you like, on the whole system my strategy of walking toward neighborliness in the relationship, which I see as a distant goal, is built on just one thing. Neither side wants to commit suicide, because we're talking about war, which will be nuclear, most likely, and which will end life as we know it, certainly in our part of the world. And this is something you can build your strategy upon, I think.
You've raised a whole series of interesting points there, and I can see from our Q&As, we've already got a large number of Q&As, that there are a number of these themes that we'll return to, but I want to spend the last 4 or 5 minutes of my direct discussion with you before opening it to the floor, just to take a couple of the other themes there. And your second theme was to explore opportunities in the non-political realm. And there are a number of examples culturally and so on. But you also said that economic cooperation has not lived up to expectations. And obviously there are the energy issues around Nord Stream 2 and so on. Do you think that the NATO countries in the Baltic and indeed elsewhere should be trying to do economic business with Russia and get a greater interdependence, or do you think that they should be trying to disentangle their economies from Russia, as many of them have been doing, to minimize exposure to the perceived threat that Russia poses? Obviously, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is an important illustration of those two alternative approaches. How do you see that in terms of moving forward in the Baltic?
Well, I think, Charles, that this is, I'm probably the wrong person to respond to that question, because this is a question about Western policy. And who am I to discuss Western policy, various options that are open to Western politicians? I can only analyze what is happening. I can see that several NATO countries in the Baltic Sea area view things very differently with regard to energy relations with Russia. Germany, as I understand it, not just the German government, and not just the German business community, but the bulk of the German population would actually support the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They think it's in the German interest. And I think that the German interest is so strong that the Biden administration has decided to waive its sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 company, or the operator of Nord Stream 2, not out of deference to Putin, clearly not as a concession in the run-up to the Geneva meeting between Biden and Putin, but as an investment by the United States into a stronger, a more cooperative, more coordinated relationship with Germany, the key American ally on the continent of Europe. So that is a recognition, I think, by Washington that Nord Stream 2 is very much in the German interest. Well, this is not in Polish interest. And this is not in the interest of the Baltic states, as I understand it, because those countries have different economic interests, and to a large degree, their importance to NATO as a whole and to the United States is very clearly linked to a confrontation with Russia. This is an internal Western, intra-European, intra-NATO dialogue, maybe internal differences. I don't want to step into that. I think it's the ground best traveled by Western analysts and Western politicians.
Okay.
So if you ask me the question I'm qualified to respond to, do you think, Dmitri, that it would be better for Russia to cut off its links with Europe and stop supplying gas to Germany, stop supplying electricity and a lot of other things to Ukraine? You would be surprised to know that the Russian-Ukrainian trade has been very lively throughout these past 7 years. And Russia has been supplying Ukraine with with a lot of things, including through transit of Russian gas to Europe. And Mr. Zelensky was basically saying Russia is trying to deprive us of the funds that we would need to upgrade our military. So Russian trade with Ukraine actually enables Ukraine to increase its defense capability. That's where we are. But let me say, I'm not favoring reducing Russia's economic exposure to Europe. It's just the opposite.
Okay, well, that's very good, Dmitri. We've got a clear idea of what you're thinking on this. You're certainly not a great deal more optimistic than I am about the state of affairs, though you set out some proposals. We've got a lot of questions coming in. I'm just going to moderate them and get through as many as I can in the half hour remaining to us. The first is from Naman Haptom from the Faculty of History at Cambridge University, who raises an important question. How significant is the issue of statelessness of ethnic Russians in the Baltic states in improving neighbourliness? He puts it in a particular way, the issue of statelessness of ethnic Russians in the Baltic states, but there are a whole set of issues about the Russian ethnic populations within the Baltic states. Might they be used by Russia as a casus belli in certain circumstances? And that, of course, is what the example of Ukraine makes people worry about. Could you just talk a little bit about that, please?
Well, let me respond very directly to the question. No, I don't think that they will be used or they will allow themselves to be used, or that Russia will try to use them as a fifth column in Estonia and Latvia. I don't think so. I think it's a disgrace that these people have not been allowed to have citizenship rights along with other residents of Estonia and Latvia. I think that Europe is giving them, those two countries, a pass, and I think it might have been understandable in the first several years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to have the Russian language, Russian education, essentially denied any official status in Estonia and Latvia, where significant portions of those countries' populations are composed of ethnic Russians, is a disgrace. It's very anti-European, if I understand the European notion of diversity. But this is up to the Europeans to decide whether they want to continue to live with this double standard. I think they would continue with that. But Russian attempt casus belli, no, I don't think so.
We've got a couple of questions about Finland's specific role from Aditya Parikh and again from Naman Haptom. The questions were, what role can Finland play in the security picture of the Baltic Sea region vis-a-vis NATO versus Russia in the context of a recent Finnish military review? And do you think Russo-Finnish relations are a potential model of neighbourliness in this? What can we learn from this relationship? Or, of course, in the time when you were serving in the armed forces, the word was Finlandization, and a whole set of questions of that kind. How do you see the Finnish role in building this neighbourly approach which you're recommending?
I think my Finnish friends would object strongly to any use of the word Finlandization. They see it as disparaging and all that. So I would say that the relations with Finland immediately after the end of the Soviet Union were probably closest to the model that I think of as the end station of this process. After 1991, Finland did not have to follow Moscow's wishes with regard to its political system, with regard to its relations with other countries. But at the same time, Finland stayed on very good terms with Russia. It sought to understand Russia. It actually claimed very good expertise of Russia. And I wouldn't say that Russia needed interpreters in Europe or in the West, but that people within their countries, within the Western club that had first-hand experience, and that experience was not as traumatized or as traumatic or traumatized, I think I would use the word, as the experience of, let's say, Poland and the Baltic states. That was a very useful thing for Russian-European relations. Today, I see Finland drifting, or maybe drifting is the wrong word, incrementally going in the direction of ever closer collaboration with the United States and NATO. I don't think that Finland is on the verge of actually deciding to apply for NATO membership. I think Finland will remain in its current status, security-wise, but certainly Finland is more of a NATO friend and a NATO partner than it has been in the 90s or the 2000s. So I think Finland still has a role to play. There are frequent contacts between the Russian leadership and the Finnish leadership, but I do not see Finland now playing much of a role within the European Union as a country that leads on Russia. Other countries lead on Russia, not Finland.
Thank you for that. Now we've got a slightly more psychological question, which I think is of interest. Tony van der Toot, who's from the Klingendahl Russia and Eastern European Center in The Hague in Holland, says, how far do Russia's own understanding of its great power status and its recently more developed civilizational narrative preclude any realistic neighbourliness and possibilities for limited cooperation? So it's the classic big neighbour, small neighbour issue. Does Russia's own perception of its own world role make the kind of neighbourliness that you're describing impossible to achieve, or can it help it?
Well, I think it's challenging. It's achieving this neighborliness relationship from the Russian side, I would say, is almost as challenging as it is from the Western side. So I'm under no illusion that somehow this is going to be embraced. This kind of concept is going to be embraced in its entirety by the Russian elite today. I think that Russia, as many other major powers, has a problem of relating to small neighbors. As I think the small neighbors have a problem of relating themselves to the former hegemonic power or to the former imperial power. And I think the way to deal with that would be through enhancing non-political contacts that I've been describing in my piece. Not so much focusing on the governments, not so much focusing on states, but doing things together as Russians and Estonians, Russians and Poles and Russians and many others, Czechs for that matter. But I think it's maybe more difficult for the smaller countries to embrace this new neighborliness, because you need a lot of self-confidence, and that self-confidence, I think, is lacking, or largely lacking, on the side of the smaller countries on, excuse me for the phrase, a Russian periphery, or Russia's former periphery, if you like. It should be easier for Russia to reach out And I commended very much Russia's effort a decade ago to start the process, for example, of historical reconciliation with Poland. You would recall President Putin, or was it Prime Minister Putin in those days, kneeling in front of the memorial in Katyn, where 10,000 Poles were murdered by the Stalin regime. And you would recall that the Patriarch of Russia made his first ever and first only for the time being official visit to Poland. The Russian Orthodox Patriarch traveled to Warsaw, traveled to Krakow, and and that was a sign of reconciliation emerging between Russia and Poland. Sadly, this was cut short by the tragedy of the Polish presidential plane, and of course the horrendous accusations that were leveled by the then Polish opposition against both Prime Minister Tusk in Poland and Prime Minister Putin in Russia. So we have a fairly difficult task to, at some point, go back to the drawing board and start the process of reconciliation. But at some point, we'll have to do that. Both sides will have to do that.
Thank you. Now, Stephen Schwitzer says, going back to your distinction between an inadvertent collision and whether it's war and the effort to stop war, he says it could have come near to war if anything had happened to that Ryanair jet. In reality, if anything had gone wrong about the Ryanair jet. And he says that there have been disagreements between the governments of Russia and Belarus in the past, and he was surprised that Belarus's action in respect to the Ryanair matter was endorsed by the Kremlin. So his central point is this incident could easily have led to war, and part of the surprising thing is the Russian response in those circumstances. Do you think?
Well, I don't see how it might have led to war, frankly. I don't see it. I don't see Belarus on the verge of shooting the plane down. I see no Russian hand in all that. You said endorsed. I think it would be more correct to say that Putin chose not to challenge publicly the Belarusian president's version of the events, which I must tell you, very few people believe in Russia. If you watch Russian television, state-owned, state-run television, you would hear tons of criticism against Lukashenko for having done that, for having laid another trap for Putin, for making Putin foot the bill every time Lukashenko does something untoward. Lukashenko is not seen as I would say, by the majority of people who are following foreign political developments and Russia's foreign policy. He's not seen as Russia's ally. He is not seen. A lot of people see him as anti-Russian. And actually, when he was practicing until a year ago, or less than a year ago, policy of multi-vector diplomacy, he was seen as I wouldn't say a darling by the West, but he was okay. Secretary Pompeo went to see him, I think a year ago, April 20. Belarus was seen as a country that was under Lukashenko's leadership gradually drifting away from Moscow, and that was welcomed. I'm not trying to protect Lukashenko. I see him as someone prone to do dangerous things, someone who could provoke Russia into doing some bad things, someone who is milking Russia every time he has a problem with the West, someone who is impervious to Russian pressure to discipline him, someone who's been manipulating Russia more than Russia has been able to pressure him. But mind you, there's no love lost between Russia and between Lukashenko and Putin. And very lastly, you talk about that incident, and I agree with you. This is a horrendous attack on the safety of air passengers, on the safety of air flights. But we had similar incidents before, when similar by Ukraine, and there was never any backlash against that in the West. There was never any backlash against the forced landing, if you like, of the Bolivian leader's plane in Vienna on suspicion that he was carrying Snowden out of Russia to Bolivia. So these things, unfortunately, do happen, and they are very dangerous for civil aviation, for the passengers who happen to be on those flights. But I'm with you on condemning the behavior of the authorities in Belarus. But that was not an incident likely to provoke war, unless you mean something else by war than I mean.
Okay. Andres Kazakamp, who's from the monk school at the University of Toronto, of Estonian origin, a very well-known scholar of Estonia, writes, respect for neighbours yes, but when Russian agents murder or attempt to murder people on EU territory, what is the appropriate reaction? What do you think the response of Western nations should be to events such as the Skripal poisoning? In a sense, this illustrates the dilemma we've just had around the Ryanair question, because all the debate in Britain was about, did you take tough sanctions against Belarus, in which case it would, quote, push Belarus into the hands of the Russians, or did you try and not take tough action to pull Belarus away from Russians? It's a kind of hopeless situation. And again, the same dilemmas on something like the Skripal poisoning, which seemed to many of us in the West as a total violation of civilized standards, well outside Russian territory and Russian interest. How do you think the Western countries should respond to that kind of thing?
Well, Charles, again, this is a question to my Western colleagues. The question you might have posed to me was, during the Chechen War, when Russia and the West were formally partners, there was quite a bit of support from the West for the people who were fighting against the Russian forces, who started a rebellion and who soon degenerated into a bunch of terrorists. Some of those people since then have found refuge in several Western countries, and Russian requests for their extradition were denied by all Western countries. So I would be happier, let's say, to tackle the issues that concern Russia and where I can have a voice. I don't have a voice in Western debates.
Let me then just ask directly about the Skripal poisoning. Do you believe that Russian sources were responsible for that attack, and that somehow went directly to the leadership of Russia? Or do you believe, as some have argued, that it was nothing to do with Russia, it was a kind of a group of individuals behaving as mavericks or whatever? How do you see that event?
Well, I don't think we have, you and I and our audience, I don't think we will know the full story. I can understand, or I can imagine, that would be better said. I can imagine the Russian leadership deciding to go against the enemies of Russia abroad, much in the way that the Israelis do that, and kill them. I think there was an attempt that's not, the Skripal case is being disputed in Russia, as you know. But there is a case which is not disputed, the killing of one of the Chechen separatist / terrorist leaders, Zelimkhan Yandarbiyev, in Qatar, which was perpetrated by Russian agents. That I think did happen on the orders coming from Moscow. My problem, I think, with some Russian actions is that they are covert rather than overt. You kill somebody and you take responsibility. You say this guy was a national security threat. We tried everything we could to get him extradited. We failed, but we still consider him a threat. And we did justice to him by doing what we did. We stand by the people who were charged with. I'm not referring to any particular case. I'm talking about the generic situation. Or let's say we do not recognize the unlawful and illegal overthrow of a government in the neighboring country. We do not recognize the new authorities who came to power through street action and street violence. And since there are people in that neighboring country who need our protection, we're moving into that country. And we take the people who would side with us under our protection, and we take responsibility for that. And if people, by mistake, take down a passenger plane, the way the United States took a passenger plane over the Persian Gulf in '88, we take responsibility for that. It was done by mistake, but it's a situation in which there are hostilities, there's an open conflict, and we take responsibility for that. But that's what it is.
Okay.
So I'm as a former military man, I'm a little bit uneasy about covert action. I think covert action signifies a degree of weakness, whereas let's say more overt action shows your strength and your preparedness for various consequences of your actions.
Thank you for that. Neil Taylor, who is has written an excellent one-volume history of Estonia and lives in Tallinn, writes from the other side of this question, really, might Russia consider some minor measures in your spirit of neighbourliness to show goodwill to the Baltic area? In the context of Estonia, will the Russian government perhaps finally ratify a border agreement or return items taken from Tartu Museum to Russia in 1918? So he's following your idea of the neighbourliness of small things to try and move it forward. But he's asking the question, what's really the prospect of Russia doing that in small things which could make a significant difference?
Well, Charles, I'm not familiar with the details, so I think it would be foolish of me to comment on something I'm not well familiar with. But yes, I think I would think about ways of facilitating, not so much maybe doing symbolic things, but facilitating contacts between people, facilitating trade, facilitating exchanges of different kinds, inviting people to conferences, concluding contracts with their companies to deliver goods, to expand tourism. Those things, I think, would bring more Estonians and more Russians in direct contact. And both sides in that relationship, at least those directly concerned, would learn to look at the neighbor as a neighbor, not as a member of NATO, not as a subject of an aggressive Russian state. And that, I think, would serve the cause of moving toward neighborliness. But having said all that, no amount of those small steps would lead to a qualitative change in the relationship. They might prepare those things, but eventually decisions will have to be taken at the political level. So the thrust of my ideas is to help prepare the ground for moving into that, moving closer to that neighborliness territory, but not really, taking us there directly.
Okay. The point about the border is it's still not been agreed. Even when I was Home Secretary 15 years ago, it was raised between the EU and Russia, and the border has not been agreed still to this day. It's an extraordinary thing. Now, Kaliningrad, you mentioned in your piece and earlier on. Colin Barnes asks, despite political issues, to what extent are there trade and commercial relations between Russia and the Baltic states, including Kaliningrad? So he's asking a question about the reality now, but he's also sharply posing the question of, is it realistic to have relations, economic relations, commercial relations between Kaliningrad and their neighbors on the Baltic?
Well, actually, they used to have pretty thriving relations, economic relations with Lithuania and Poland, particularly with Lithuania, because under the Soviet Union, Kaliningrad was linked to the Lithuanian energy system, and they were dependent on energy supplies from Lithuania. This has changed, but in my view, again, I don't know the details of Russian trade in the Kaliningrad region with Lithuania or with Poland, for that matter. But let me just mention one thing. For a long time, there was not long time, but several years prior to the current period of confrontation, there was a very successful program between Poland and Russia in the Kaliningrad area that allowed people within a certain distance from the border, I don't know, 100 kilometers or 50 kilometers, to travel freely and communicate freely. And this was something that people on both sides used mostly for commercial purposes, where some things were cheaper than on their side of the border. They would go and buy it and take it home. But it also built relations as neighbors, because Poland and Lithuania are clearly, well, look at the map, they are more direct neighbors to Kaliningraders than mainland Russia. And a lot of those Kaliningraders would travel more frequently to Vilnius or to Gdansk than they would travel to Moscow or St. Petersburg. And unfortunately, this is something that we have lost, or largely lost, in the last few years. But I hope that this can be restored with relatively few efforts by both sides.
We're almost at our end now, Dmitri. It's been an extremely interesting conversation, for which I'm very grateful. I'm just going to take a final comment and a final question. The comment is from Stephen Schwitzer, who contests what you're saying about Ukraine's membership of NATO. He says the Secretary General of NATO has recently stated that Ukraine will never be accepted as a candidate for NATO. He says this comes from the Secretary General of NATO because there's a present and continuing conflict, i.e. in eastern Ukraine, which he comments is unlikely to end anytime soon. So he's contesting what you said earlier on, and I'd be interested in any comments you've got. And the final question that I want to ask comes from Roger Bass, the Chief Executive of Global Standard Money and Settlement Limited, saying that Russia increasingly sees itself, I think, as a Eurasian nation and power, and India is becoming a more important partner for the US and Europe, having historically good relations with Russia. Closer economic relations between the two and jointly with Central Asia might have large implications for both as to relations with the rest of the world. So saying that the Indo-Pacific shift in US and UK positions and the important role of India and its historic relationship with Russia could help this dialogue. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that and whether it's an interesting point. So two final points: the Ukrainian membership of NATO question and this Russia as a Eurasian power point for your reflections.
Charles, thank you very much, and thanks for those very good questions. I need to clarify what I said. I'm sorry if someone misunderstood what I said. I was referring to President Putin's statement on Ukraine, broadcast yesterday, in which he basically said, I cannot trust protestations from the United States that Ukraine will not be given NATO membership. I have to prepare for the worst. This is the essence of what Vladimir Putin was saying, and I find this to be important and very worrisome.
Okay.
My own view is that Ukraine will probably not become a member of NATO in the foreseeable future, or maybe even in my lifetime, the rest of my lifetime. But to be a security problem for Russia, it doesn't have to be in NATO. You don't have to be in NATO to host US bases. You don't have to be in NATO to take part in very close military exercises. There's so many things that you can do as a non-member of NATO, provided you have a very close relationship, military security relationship with the United States, which Ukraine currently does. So that is a clarification. I think it's an important clarification, and thank you for raising that issue. With regard to Russia as a Eurasian power, well, yes, it is a Eurasian power, which I think is a normal description of Russia. Russia is not part of Europe politically. Russia is not part of Asia politically because there's no political Asia. Russia has to manage relations with its many neighbors in Eurasia. Europe in the west, China in the east, the Muslim world and India in the south. There are all sorts of balances and counterbalances that Russia will have to strike. Essentially, Russia is a loner. It's a lone power, and it will stay that way. It will not be part of any alliance of which Russia is not the boss. And having rejected junior partnership of the United States, which I think was the entry ticket to any kind of closer integrated relationship between Russia and NATO, Russia is certainly going to reject any offer or any demand of being China's vassal state or tributary state. So Russia will remain Russia. Russia will remain a neighbor to European, I wanted to say friends, but let's say European neighbors. And building neighborliness between two physical neighbors is not an impossible task. It's something that we need to think of very seriously and look at as a task for the foreseeable future. I remain committed to neighborliness. I think it's doable, and I think both sides would have an interest in that. It's an objective which is totally realistic, which recognizes diversity, which respects both parties or multiple parties on both sides of the divide between Russia and the European Union, Russia and NATO. This is something that I hope I can see the beginning of even before I pass from this world.
That's a very miserable note to end on. Dmitri, you've been tremendously fluent and open and clear about your thinking. I think we've had an excellent discussion this evening. I'm delighted that you've kicked it off by your piece on New Year's Eve last year. And I think we will try and find ways to continue the dialogue on these questions. But I'm not going to allow myself to be diverted about worrying whether you're going to die or not in the foreseeable future. But we hope that we can have a positive and constructive relationship in the future. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll close the session this evening. Many thanks. Good evening.